Hello YouTube, it's Qnix. I'm back with a long-awaited tutorial for another effect on my channel. This is the HSL Splitting effect, where I take a video and I split the color information into the channel's hue, saturation, and luminance. It's mostly self-explanatory, unlike a lot of my other effects that require a deep dive. You know, the hue channel just shows the color information without regard to saturation or luminance. The saturation information is just that, and the luminance information is also just how light the color is. This effect is fairly straightforward, but I will say right off the bat that it is not as straightforward on Linux. And in fact, I have not, well, I shouldn't say on Linux, I should say in open source software, because I have tried to apply this in Kdenlive, and I can get an approximation that looks pretty good, but I can't quite get it to the accuracy of Sony Vegas. And the reason for that, I believe, is that in Sony Vegas, the lightness is just treated as a sort of absolute lightness. Where, you know, black has a lightness of 0, all the primary colors, red, green, blue, and the mixed primary colors, yellow, cyan, magenta, have a lightness of 0.5, and white has a lightness of 1. But in Kdenlive, I believe that lightness is perceptual, meaning that the value of the lightness actually varies with how sensitive your eye is to the color, which means that blues would be portrayed lighter to compensate for the fact that our eyes are not particularly sensitive to blue, and yellows would be portrayed darker because our eyes are very sensitive to yellow. I don't know if this is actually what's going on, but it does seem to be the case based on the evidence I have. So I'm still going to be going through 2 tutorials, one for Sony Vegas and one for Kdenlive. Even though in Kdenlive I can't quite reach the same accuracy as Vegas Pro, I can still get a decent approximation that pretty much serves the same purpose of showing how the colors in the video are broken down into HSL. So I'm going to start us off in on the Linux side of things. I'm going to start us off with FFmpeg. This is a purely optional step. This is a step that I am doing to upscale the video so that it looks a little bit better when I do some edits, but it is not required. So do feel free to skip ahead to the portion where I open Sony Vegas if you don't want to upscale your video. But before I begin, I will just quickly play the video I've chosen as a sample. This should work. Okay, so this is the logo I've chosen to edit for today, and I chose it because for the HSL effect, you want a logo that has a very wide variety of colors. You want to have bright and dark colors, saturated and not very saturated colors, and you want colors all over the spectrum. So it's not going to be easy to find a logo that perfectly satisfies that requirement, but I do feel like the logo that I chose has a good variety of colors. Now I'm going to do my upscaling. I'm not going to get into full detail because I always do the upscaling whenever I do a tutorial, but I will show you some things that stick out. So I'm going to do FFmpeg -I is going to be the video I'm going to edit. VF, I'm going to, how did I do this before? Yes. I'm going to first apply format equals RGB24. Just seems to be better quality for editing purposes. And then I'll crop the edges off, as I always do, 0.95 times IW, and H equals 0.95 times IH. Now here's really the only thing that's going to be different. I'm going to scale the video up, but I'm going to make two changes. First off, I'm not trying to scale this video up to full resolution. So I usually render my videos in 4K resolution, but I don't need to have this video in 4K resolution for the purposes of editing, because I'm ultimately going to be putting it in a 2x2 grid. The other thing is that I typically stretch the video out to a widescreen resolution, but I don't necessarily need to do that for this effect. So I'm going to apply scale, and I'm going to say that the width is going to be 1440, and the height is going to be 1080. And the reason why I'm doing this is I know I want the height to be 1080 pixels because the height of my final video is going to be 2160 pixels. So I want half of that. Now, if I was working with a widescreen video, which you are allowed to do, I would set the width to 1920, but because I'm working with a video that's natively in a 4x3 format, I am instead setting the width to 1440 so that the aspect ratio is 4:3. Then I'm going to do minterpolate, FPS equals 60, MI mode equals MCI, MC mode equals AOBMC, ME mode equals BIDR, and VSBMC equals 1. And then finally I'm going to add a denoiser. So this should be all of the video filters that I want to use. I set the format to RGB24, I crop off the edges, I scale it up. Okay. Now another thing I want to add, if you want to use this upscaled video in Sony Vegas, Sony Vegas is a little bit more picky about the codecs of the video that you put into it than Kdenlive. I usually like to use lossless formats such as lossless JPEG 2000 or FFV1 or something like that. But it doesn't seem like Sony Vegas necessarily likes those codecs, and I don't know for sure which ones it does like. So I am going to render this in a lossy but fairly high quality format. So I'll say CV is libx264, QP is 18. This sets the quality pretty high. Preset medium, because we don't want this to take too long to render. I'll just reiterate that I want the size to be 1440 by 1080, and the aspect should be 4:3, and the rate should be 60. Oh, and the last thing I'll do is I'll set the pixel format back to YUV 420p. That seems to be the most compatible pixel format with Vegas and such. I'm also going to upscale the audio. I'm going to do that the same way I normally do. A resample equals 48,000 hertz. A exciter, A FFTDM. And I will map this. This I can map to a lossless codec. I'll render it to ALAC, which is Apple Lossless Audio, and I will save this as upscale.mov, because the MOV file format is compatible with H.264 video and ALAC audio. You are not strictly required to use the same codecs I do. These are just what I These are what I recommend for a good mix of high quality and compatibility with Sony Vegas. If you're only working on Linux systems, or you're only working with open source programs such as Kdenlive, you could set a lossless video codec such as Lossless JPEG 2000. So I'm going to render this. It shouldn't take too long, but there's not much we can do until I finish this step, so I'll let it go. Oh, I didn't like that. Error applying option scale to filter crop. Did I... Oh, don't tell me I did it again. Oh, thank goodness. Okay, I didn't do the same thing I always do, where I put a comma where I should put a colon. I actually did the reverse. I put a colon where I should put a comma. Okay, this should work now. All right, it's going. So I'm going to let this go, and I'll come back when it's done. Okay, the video seems to have finished rendering. Took a little bit longer than I was expecting, not gonna lie. But let's see how it looks. All right, so it's looking good. So we finished doing the upscaling, and now that the video is ready, I am going to send it over to my Sony Vegas machine, and I'm going to show you how to apply the HSL effect in Sony Vegas Pro. Hello, Unregistered Hypercam 2. It is me, Unregistered Hypercam 2, and I'm here to show you an Unregistered Hypercam 2 to apply the HSL effect to Unregistered Hypercam 2. But no, seriously, this is my Windows 7 machine that I recently set up. I'm very proud of it. It took me a heck of a lot of effort to manually install a bunch of drivers and set it up in a way that I could connect to it over a private network without having it connected to the internet. But it was well worth the effort because this is a very fun and nostalgic machine. It not only does it have Sony Vegas on it, but it also has a bunch of different programs that are pretty nostalgic to me, that are reminiscent of the early days of my YouTube channel. So, Vegas Pro. I'm using a relatively old version of Vegas Pro, and one thing that I think is important to note is that I've noticed in some newer versions of Vegas Pro, the HSLA color space is not available in Channel Blend. I don't know precisely what versions do have it and what versions don't, but I'll just tell you right off the bat that you may not be using a version that has the right stuff, and I don't really know if there's anything I can do about that. So I will show you, assuming you have a version of Vegas Pro at your disposal that does have all the right things in it, and one of those versions is 12. So I already have this open to have my upscaled video at the ready here. So I'm going to bring it in. I will not match the settings. And what's going to happen if I try to play it? It may be a little bit slow because I am also recording things. Okay, yeah, it's pretty slow because I'm also recording a video in the background while I do this. So I'm just going to set it to a frame with a lot of colors so we can see how this effect applies to the colors. That's a good one. So the first thing I want to do is I want to set this video up into a 2x2 grid. So I'm going to take my video track and I'm going to duplicate it into 4. And for each one, I'm going to set it in a quadrant of the video. So I'll set the width to 1920. And it automatically sets the height to 1080. I'll set the Y to negative, I think it's going to be half of 1080. Let me try negative 540. Oh, that brings it down. Okay, so half of 1080 is 540. We're going to bring it up. And then the X position is going to be a little bit different. I think it's going to be half of 1440, which is negative 720. Let's see if that looks right. It does look right. So the math that I just did. First, I said I want the height of the video to be 1920 by 1080. It's okay to say 1920 by 1080 even if your video is in 4:3 resolution, because this just sets the height and width of the track, and it will automatically fit the video to the track. I took half of the width is the width of the track is 1920, but the width of my video is 1440. So I took half of that, and that's 720, and I just set that as the X coordinate, and the negative 720 means I'm going to the left. If I did a positive 720, I'd be going to the right. The Y value of 540, that's half the height. If that was negative, it would go down, positive goes up. Easy enough. So let me just do that for all the other ones. But I'm going to set this to positive 720 and positive 540. Okay. Let's do negative 720, negative 540. Cool. Finally, I'm going to do 1920, 720, negative 540. There we go. Now I'm going to add the HSL effects to each of these tracks. So I'm going to go into track effects for the first track. Usually I do this in order of hue, saturation, luminance. So I'm going to set this to be the hue channel. So I'm going to go to channel blend, and the default color space is RGBA, but we have to set this to HSLA. It will turn the video black, that's totally fine. So the key here is that we want to show only hue information. So I'm going to set the hue equal to 1 times hue. However, I'm not going to set the saturation to 1 times saturation. I'm actually going to go all the way to the end and set the saturation to just 1. So the colors are going to be fully saturated. And this allows us to see the colors at their brightest. I could do any saturation I wanted, but I feel like showing the saturation at its maximum is best, because that you could think of that as the most pure colors. I'm going to set the lightness to equal a half, 0.5. If I set it to 1, that would just make the entire video white, and then we have no color information whatsoever. And then finally, I'm going to set the alpha to 1 times alpha. And there we go. We can finally see that we have the same colors, but we only have color information. So this is a bright yellow, it's still a bright yellow. Down here we have more of a muted red, this shows up as a very bright red. The background is this cool black, it shows up as green and blue. So it's the same colors, just with no information about saturation and lightness. Now it is tempting to set the alpha to 1 because we don't want any transparency, but if you do, then you'll get these ugly bars that bleed into the other tracks that you don't want, so just set the alpha to 1 times alpha and not to 1. Moving on to saturation. Track effects, channel blend. Alright, we're going to go back to HSLA. I'm going to leave the hue as 0 because we don't want hue information. I'm going to set the saturation to 1 times saturation because we do want saturation information. And I'm going to set the lightness to 0.5. And I'm going to set the alpha to 1. Now, I have seen some comments before about how the saturation is just red. It's just red and gray. The reason why I choose to represent this as gray and red is because intuitively I want the saturation scale, which goes from completely desaturated to completely saturated, represented by a color that is completely desaturated and a color that is completely saturated. So I choose gray as my sort of minimum and red as my sort of maximum. You could, however, choose any color that you want. If you were so inclined, you could choose to maybe add 0.333. Oh, what happened there? Oh, that turned up the saturation. Whoopsie. You could set the hue to anything you want. You could set this to 0.333, then your scale is from gray to green. You could set it to something like 0.65, and then your scale is from gray to blue. But I think because red has a hue of 0, it's just the most intuitive thing to choose. We also don't want the lightness to be anything other than 0.5. If I set it to something like 1, well, then that changes it to be completely over the top. If we allowed lightness information in there, then we're kind of bleeding lightness information into the saturation, which we don't want. So I'm going to set this back to 0. And this makes sense. You know, down here we see a brightish blue. Up here we see a bright red. The only thing that's a little bit surprising is that the sky is very saturated. I think it's maybe just because when you have really dark colors, saturation is treated a little bit differently. So it could be that it's technically like a dark green. This makes sense because this is very obviously gray, and it shows up as gray. So I think this makes sense. All right, let's move on to lightness. This one is pretty straightforward. We're going to go to Channel Blend, Channel Blend, Channel Blend, HSLA. We're going to set the hue to 0. We're going to set the saturation to be 0 because we don't want color information anymore. We will set the lightness to be 1 times the lightness, and we will set the alpha to be 1 times the alpha. And now we have our lightness information. And this is literally just light colors become white, dark colors become black. Easy enough. And then the last track, we're just going to leave as is. We don't need to do anything special here because I usually leave the original in there so you can kind of look at all 3 of these channels together and see how the results of the splitting intuitively follows from the color you see. So you could, for example, say, oh, looking in the middle of the video, we have this kind of macaroni orange line here. Well, the hue tells me it's yellow, the saturation tells me that it's saturated, and the lightness tells me it's moderate brightness. So I think this is going to be a moderately bright, highly saturated orangey yellow, and that's what we see. Now, I believe I also have an overlay. Oh yes, I made an overlay in PowerPoint that you can add if you want to. Technically, the video event or the video effect is done being applied, but for the sake of clarity, what I usually do is I'll add these titles here that say what the channels are. So I make a track that just says, you know, hue is over here on the upper left, saturation is on the upper right, lightness is on the lower left, and the original is on the lower right. And this doesn't change the video itself, it just adds some clarity. Before I finish up in Sony Vegas, I'll do 2 things. This isn't... Actually, do I need to? Let me see what this is. Oh, that's my corner logo. Okay, so the last thing I'll talk about is adding my corner logo. Usually I add this in the center of the video because if I set it in a corner, it would obstruct the titles. So I just go to the track motion and I set the width to be 1/4 of what I normally do, 960. You can do whatever you want with your corner logo, but this is just usually how I do it. So I am not going to render this immediately because I noticed that the audio is a little bit strange. It's very quiet and is only coming out of 1 channel. But I won't go over how to fix this because it's not part of the video effect, and I think it's only a problem with this particular video I'm using. So the video event in Sony Vegas is done, and now I'm going to go back to open source land to show you how to do it in Kdenlive. Okay, I am back to Kdenlive on Linux land. Mind you, you do not need to be in Linux, but if you have Kdenlive on Windows, or I think even Mac, for example, these are some steps that you could take. So, I have already imported my video. I'm going to add it. Easy enough. This is the upscaled video. So I'm going to start off by doing something kind of like what I did in Sony Vegas. I'm just going to duplicate this video 4 times. So I'm going to add, I think I want a 5th, yeah, I want a 5th track for my corner logo. So I'll add 3 tracks. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's good. I'm going to ungroup my video from my audio, and then I'll just Control-C and paste it into each track. Except for the top one, because that's going to be where my logo goes. So now I have 4 copies of the video, and I'm going to set them up in a 4x4 grid like I always do. But it's going to be a little bit more complicated here because Kdenlive likes to use the top left corner instead of the center for everything. So there's a little bit more math involved in where the track should go. So I'm going to set the size to be 50%, and I'm going to set this to be in the upper left corner. And then let me see. The width is, oh, I gotta get a piece of paper for this. So I want to move it into the video the length of one of those bars. So let's see. 1920 minus 1440 is 0. That becomes an 8. 12, 4, 8. And then 8 minus 4 is 4. That's 480. And then divide that by 2, that's 240. So I believe I should position this track at 240x. And that does look good. I'm going to transform video 3. I'll set the size to 50%. I'll set it to be in the upper right corner, but then I will subtract 240, which should be 1680. Yep, okay. I'm going to do this same thing. This is going to be in the bottom left corner, but I'm going to add 240. And finally, I'm going to put the original in the bottom right corner. And that's going to be at 1680. Okay, so we have our grid made. I'm going to go to a representative frame, kind of like what I had before. Okay, so now let's add the color effects to get to hue and saturation, luminance information. I'm going to apply the effect curves twice to the first video track. This is going to be the track that has our hue information. Now, as I did in Sony Vegas, I'm extracting the pure information on hue, saturation, and luminance by basically removing the information for everything else. So what I'm going to do is set the saturation and luminance so that they don't correspond to anything in the video at all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the saturation. And I'm going to take this curve and I'll drag it all the way up so that the saturation is always maximum. Then I'm going to go to the next curve. I'll set the luma to always be a half. And I can verify, can I verify that I'm doing this right? Normally it gives me values. Is it gonna give me precise values for the Bezier curves? I may want to use Bezier curves instead. Let me give that a try. Let me use Bezier curves instead. Neither of them actually give me precise numerical information. I'm not too fond of that. Well, we're going to do our best. Like I said, it may not be particularly accurate anyway. So I'm going to go back to curves. I think that effect is a little bit simpler. I'll apply it twice. And I'm going to do what I did before. I'm going to drag the saturation all the way up to 1. Then I'm going to drag the luma. I'm going to try my best to get this to be a half. And a half. It's probably the best I can do. It's pretty much a straight line going down the middle. And the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to see if moving the luma up has any effect. It does. I think maybe well, that's black. If I have hue information, that shouldn't be black. So I'm gonna put the luma up 1. And you can see it's a little bit different. The greens look darker, the blues look lighter, just as I predicted, because it's adjusting the color to our sensitivity. So the colors are supposed to look like they're the same brightness. I don't think that's the case. I think that the red at the bottom looks much brighter than the green on the top. Last thing I'll do is I'll try changing this. It changes a little bit. I think I'll actually do this. The 601. Let me play with it with saturation. Okay, with saturation it doesn't really change anything. So yeah, maybe set the luma formula to 601. I think it looks a little bit better. Now I'm going to do the saturation information for the second track. So I just dragged curves onto V3, and I'm going to first set the hue to be 0, and the luma, I'm going to do the same thing I did before, where I tried to set it as close as I could to just halfway. And I think that looks, maybe I'll drag this up 1. Yeah, that looks good. Oh, and I never set this to luma. Oopsie. Okay, now I set it to luma. I'm going to go back to Rec 601 because I think that looked a little bit better. And I'm going to move this up. Oh, that actually doesn't look quite as good. Let me move this back down. I think it seems a little bit too bright. I'll leave whether you want hue and luma first or luma and hue first. Or sorry, if you want to do luma then hue or hue. If you want to apply the luma curve first and then the hue curve, or the hue curve first and then the luma, I will leave that up to you. I think even though luma at the bottom would technically be more accurate because we do clearly have only fully saturated red and gray, it also seems like it's inflating the saturation a little bit, so I am going to put luma first. Finally, I'm going to do the lightness channel, so I'm just going to drag curves twice onto V2, and this one is much more straightforward. I think we don't have to set the hue to 0, actually. Well, let me try it first. I'll set the hue to 0. Oh, that actually looked really cool. Sorry. Let me set the saturation to 0. Okay, so now it's all grayscale. And then out of curiosity, well, I'll set this to 601 too. Out of curiosity, let me see if I didn't do anything with hue. Alright, it doesn't change anything. So I'll just delete the hue information. Setting the saturation to 0 should be enough. And then we have the original video. Do I have the HSL title that I had in over in Vegas Pro? Let me see. I may have to pull that in, so I'm gonna pause the video here so I can do that. Okay, so I didn't have the picture on this computer, so I just moved it over. I'm going to insert a track below all of this gobbledygook. Below. Let me try that again. Insert a track under V1 and drag the HSL event to be the whole thing. And then finally I'm going to add my corner logo in there. Not really a corner logo because I'm going to put it in the middle. Set that to scale 25. And there we go. So that is how you would apply the HSL effect in Kdenlive. Now, I would love to figure out how to apply this effect in FFmpeg, because you guys know that I'm using FFmpeg a lot more. I think it's very powerful from an automation perspective and pretty flexible too. But I do think that for now, being able to do it in Vegas Pro and Kdenlive is a pretty cool accomplishment. And it looks a little bit different between the two, but either way, I am conveying the same information. If anybody does have some insight on how to get these to look a little bit more like in Vegas Pro, where the luminance is considered absolute instead of perceptual, I would love to hear it. In the meantime, that is it for me today. So I hope this was informative to you. Feel free to go to the comment, ask any questions you have. Thank you for your time, and have a good day. Testing my microphone, testing my microphone, testing my microphone, testing my microphone.